All right, well, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson, president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and I want to welcome you to an event on should we be thinking about this increasing furor about breaking up big tech. So we have a great panel this morning. Before I introduce them, I do want to make a few opening and framing remarks, and then we'll just jump into this great panel, and we should have at least 20 or 30 minutes for questions and conversation from you all. Also want to mention, I can't resist, since we're talking about tech, we have a great event next week on Tuesday, up on Capitol Hill on the role of robotics in technology innovation. And speaking of robots, there will be a robot there that will actually introduce me. So that's kind of cool. If you've ever seen Pepper the robot. So there'll actually be Pepper, there'll be another robot there, so it's a fun event. It's on our website. So there's been an increasing debate really in the last couple of years. You see it now with some of the presidential candidates on the Democratic side, but certainly others who are concerned about the purported market power of large technology firms. And there are, in antitrust circles, there's sort of two ways to think about market power. One is structural remedies and one is conduct remedies. And historically, the focus has been on conduct remedies. If you think about the Microsoft case back in the late 90s and 2000, the Microsoft case was a conduct remedy. There was an assertion that Microsoft was using its power over Windows and Office to hurt competitors, and so the remedy was that they had to fix that, which they did. There were people at the time pushing a structural remedy, which would be to break up Microsoft somehow, and structural remedies are largely seen as kind of a last resort. We did it with AT&T, we did it with Standard Oil, but by and large, antitrust authorities have not embraced that. Now what we're seeing, though, is an increasing focus on perhaps we need structural remedies, which ITIF would disagree with. There are lots and lots of reasons why, quote, market power in these industries is actually pro-innovation and pro-consumer. Let me read two quotes from you that I think put this in perspective, both from the Obama administration, Council of Economic Advisors. In a report, they talked about market power and innovation. The first quote says, quote, allowing firms to exercise the market power they have acquired legitimately can maintain incentives for research and development, new product introduction, productivity gains, and entry into new markets, all of which promote long-term economic growth. And we certainly see that today. If you look at the top 15 firms in the world in terms of R&D investment, 6 of them are American tech companies. Amazon, Alphabet, Apple, and Facebook. These 5 companies invest more in R&D, invest 7 times more in R&D than the National Science Foundation. And they're able to do that because they have scale economies. The second quote from the Obama administration it says, quote, some newer technology markets are characterized by network effects with large positive spillovers from having many consumers use the same product. Markets in which network effects are important, such as social media sites, may become dominated by one firm. How many people here use Facebook? How many people would like the government to make you use Facebook and Headbook? In other words, you now have to post twice on a social media site because having one only is a monopoly. The answer is obviously you don't want to do that. How many people buy on Amazon? Okay, I would be surprised if there's. How many people don't buy on Amazon? Well, okay, 0. Did I see a hand go? Oh, good. All right. And how many people would like to, when you go on Amazon, I just bought batteries the other day, would like to be able to go on Amazon and have the Amazon site only for Amazon batteries and then have the Amazon reseller site only for other batteries? Nobody would want that. And yet there are calls for breaking up Amazon into 2 separate sites, one for resellers or marketplace and the other for Amazon products only. I just want to leave you with one last thought on this, which is I think Nick Clegg, I guess, who now works for Facebook. He had been head of, I think, the Liberal Party in the UK. And he raised this point last week, I believe, which is a point we've raised for many, many years. If you break up big tech, essentially what you're doing is you're opening up the field for China big tech. Because I can guarantee you that China is not breaking up their big tech. If anything, what China is doing is asking for and encouraging more consolidation in Chinese tech companies. We've been down this road before with utterly disastrous consequences. As my colleague Mike Lind and I wrote in our MIT Press book from last year, Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. In the 50s and 60s, the US government aggressively forced American technology leaders to give away or sell at rock-bottom fire sale prices their intellectual property. They did this with RCA. Anybody old enough to remember RCA was the leading television producer and innovator in the world. The RCA monopoly increased prices 1.4%. And so they forced them to give away their technology, and guess who got it? Sony. When the Justice Department forced AT&T to give away their, essentially to license at a very, very low rate their transistor technology, it really led to a lot of important things like Texas Instruments being able to get it. But the government forced them to license it at such a low price that the Japanese were able to get it. And that's how Sony and some of the other Japanese electronics companies really took off, because they now had this technology licensed for virtually no money. And we saw that in many, many other industries. Xerox, when the FTC decided they were going to force Xerox to essentially give away for free all of their patents, all of their design drawings, every piece of intellectual property that Xerox had. The goal was, according to the FTC, to reduce the market share of Xerox copiers in half in 5 years. And they were successful because Japanese copiers took the market share and they got all this technology for free. So we have to think about this question of technology and competition and breaking up big tech. We have to think about it, I would argue, in this context of international competition. So with that long framing, let me now introduce it to our real speakers. And I want to start I'm going to start in the order, I'm going to go in the order that we're going to hear from. Thibault Schreppel is a faculty affiliate at the Berkman Center at Harvard. He's also an assistant professor in European economic law at the Utrecht University School of Law in the Netherlands, and he's joining us through the magic of the Beam telepresence, so thank you. His writing focuses on innovation in digital markets relating to competition law, and his work has led to the introduction of several legislative proposals across Europe. He recently wrote an excellent paper, which I would encourage you all to read. It's on SSRN. In fact, it was one of the most top 10 downloaded articles, including his other work, a piece called Antitrust Without Romance. And Thibault can talk a little bit about that. Really fascinating analysis of how European and American antitrust officials, naming them by name, think about antitrust from a more from a more objective, rational perspective, or more from a kind of populist, romantic perspective. He received his PhD from the University of Paris-Saclay. Seth Bloom. Seth is a longtime colleague. He's president and founder of Bloom Strategic Counsel. He spent 14 years prior to that working in the U.S. Senate on the Democratic side on the Judiciary's Committee Antitrust Subcommittee. So he really was the go-to person in the Senate on the Democratic side for antitrust policy questions. He also spent time as a trial attorney at the DOJ's Antitrust Division and has a law degree from University of Pennsylvania Law School. Alex Stapp is a research fellow at the International Center for Law and Economics. His research interests include tech policy and antitrust law. Prior to that, he was a fellow at the Niskanen Center. He has a master's degree from George Mason University. And finally, Jason Oxman, who's the president, I should say the newish president and CEO of ITI, the Information Technology Industry Council. He has over 20 years experience in technology advocacy. Prior to joining ITI, Jason was the head of the CEO of ETA, which is International Trade Association on Payments Industry, Payments Technology. He was also senior vice president at the Consumer Technology Association, and I believe you were at the FCC back in early days in his career, and began his legal career as a law clerk for the Maine Supreme Court, has a JD and an MS from Boston University. So with that, Thibault, I'll look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Usually I say thanks a lot for having me, but today I guess I have to say thanks a lot for having my robot. I'm actually in Utrecht. I just left the teaching building, and actually on my way where I was teaching about blockchain, I just realized, well, maybe all I should say is should we break up tech companies? Well, let's just wait for blockchain to take care of it. But so today I won't discuss blockchain unless you have questions. In that case, I will be very pleased to answer those questions. What I want to do in those short 10 minutes is to actually start with the end of the spectrum, I guess, because today's conference is entitled "Breaking Up Tech, Big Tech: Making Sense of the Debate," and I thought that instead of focusing on the first part, which is breaking up big tech, I will focus on the making sense of the debate. Not that I expect to make sense of the debate necessarily, but at least I'm going to try to bring a different perspective on why breaking up big tech is being discussed. So let me start here. Last year and in the following weeks, I will be publishing, and I published already, a series of conversations with Nobel laureates in economics. And for that, I've talked to more than 10 of them. So it's a small sample, but still quite representative of all of the Nobel laureates still being alive, because usually you get Nobel so old, but anyway. So that's a different story. So I've discussed big tech and antitrust with all of them. And although obviously they have different perspectives, some of them you may know Angus Deaton, who has different perspective than Michael Spence, for instance. But here's the common pattern between all of them. All of them told me, I do not know what will be the economic effect, the overall effect of breaking up big tech. I have no idea. And in fact, I realized that I never met any economist showing me empirical evidence that breaking up big tech would overall be great for consumers, nor any political scientists proving by taking everything into account that breaking up big tech would be good for political reasons, protecting democracies, and all that we hear nowadays. And so this refers me to a previous Nobel laureate, Friedrich Hayek, who in his Nobel acceptance speech discussed the pretense of knowledge. You may be familiar with this speech. It's a short one. I really recommend you to read it if you haven't already. And so Friedrich Hayek argued that some issues will always remain too complex for the human brain. That's there is too many things to take into account, and we can't do it. It's super frustrating, probably, but that's his opinion, and I very much agree with that. And so here, I would argue that breaking up big tech, there are too many microeconomic issues to be taken into account, and I will actually discuss how the people arguing for breaking up big tech go around that and find another solution. But so in the absence of clear-cut conclusions, here's why I think that some people are still arguing for breaking up big tech, because you would think, well, if we don't know, then why can we violate property rights? Well, some people do it, and here I want to bring a last Nobel laureate in economics, and that person is James Buchanan. So indeed, and thank you for mentioning this paper, I've recently published a paper entitled Antitrust Without Romance, which is actually based on the lecture that gave James Buchanan in 78. So unfortunately, we are still stuck with the same problems. And this lecture was entitled Politics Without Romance. And later on came up a paper that he published on public choice. And so here's the idea. James Buchanan was arguing that, yes, market fail. They're not always perfect, and there are failures of the market. But so do governments. And accordingly, we should get rid of the presumption that correction for market failures accomplish the desired objectives. And obviously, we hear a lot about, there is a market failure. First, I'm not always convinced, but let's say there is a market failure. We hear a lot about, then we should do something, without discussing if we can actually reach the goal of what we want to achieve. And so that was the idea of James Buchanan, and that's the idea on which I wrote this paper called Antitrust Without Romance. And so the idea was to say that we should actually, in case of market failures, that's the first step. But the second step will be to prove that what we want to do will actually help correcting the market failure, and that the situation won't be actually worth or equal that the situation before we do anything. And so here what is interesting is that James Buchanan argued that the reason why government fail, first is because they can't get to understand everything. And secondly, it's because some top officials sometimes may have a personal interest of doing something, although it's not clear that the result will be great. And so now here's the question. Do you think that for some politicians, arguing for breaking up big tech is a good political strategy? And I think the answer is yes. Some politicians want to argue for that, and it's actually a very good political strategy because, and that's what they portray, tech giants represents the elites against the people. And so if indeed tech giants is the elite and is doing bad things to the people, then if one politician can come in and do something, then it's suddenly a savior, and it's great. And after all, who doesn't like David and Goliath, right? So on this basis, in this paper, I've analyzed all of the speeches of the 5 actual FTC commissioners, and I've done the same with the actual EU Commissioner for Competition, Margaret Vestager, and the 3 previous ones, Monti, Kroes, and Almunia. And what I found is that they tend more and more, unfortunately, to demonize companies and to portray those companies as being evil. And on that basis, they ask for and they argue for breaking up big tech companies. So here are some numbers. Margaret Vestager is opposing us, meaning the people, versus companies, and she uses the pronoun them, in more than 80% of all of her speeches. So in 4 speeches out of 5, she will actually say, well, those companies, them, they do things to us, the people, and we suffer from that. And if you compare with previous EU commissioners, they were doing that in less than 10% of their speeches. So you see there is a dramatic change in the discourse that she's using. And on this basis, she mentions the possibility of breaking up tech company in some official speeches. And of course, that is new. None of the previous EU commissioners have ever even mentioned the idea. In the US, I've done the same with the speeches of Makan Derrahim, and is opposing tech companies and the people in less than 10% of his speeches. So he's not doing it like we used to do in Europe, not doing it. And the same goes more or less for FTC commissioners, although what I did find is that there is a tendency to do it more and more. And in fact, there is already one commissioner, and I will give name once again, Rohit Chopra, who is opposing big tech companies versus the people in more than 30% of all of his speeches. So this is less than we do in Europe, but still you see the trend that is growing. And you also see, and I've done the analysis of some academic papers, including those of Lina Khan and the Open Market Institute, and they do oppose big tech companies and the people all the time, 100% of everything they write. And so on this basis, what you see is that they do say that companies, not only they are opposed to the people, but what they do, and here I quote, they are a threat to democracy, a threat to civil rights, nothing less. And actually, if you are, and here I quote, a reasonable people or reasonable mind, then you have to reach the same conclusion, that tech companies are bad. And if you do not reach the same conclusion, you are not someone reasonable. And so again, they build on the rhetoric for breaking up tech companies based on all that. And so, and I'm almost done. So here, I think it's important to remember that we do have no idea whether breaking up big tech will be good or bad. And I'm sure we hear today some argument probably pro and cons. But so in short, we have no idea. And yet, those FTC commissioners and EU commissioners, they go for it because they may shine using this strategy. And so they portray companies as being demon, evil, death threats. And what you see more and more also is that they are more and more moralist, sentimental in a way. So it is the good versus bad, the wrong versus right. So you see more and more references to, the good people versus the bad people. And obviously, why would you do nothing against the bad people, right? And so what you see also is that they use that, and of course it's super good for them to be re-elected or reappointed. And we have a very good example of the actual EU Commissioner for Competition who almost got the head of the European Commission. So this is working. So to conclude, what I would like to stress is that what you see very clearly if you analyze all of the, most of the academic paper in antitrust is that over the last 30 years, somehow, I don't know how exactly, we were safe and secure from political strategies taking over antitrust. And whether or not you were progressive or conservative, there was an agreement that this is the direction we should take. And it wasn't any purely political strategy. I think now this is over, and for some time, several of us thought, well, this is too political, this is not legal, therefore let's not engage. And I think that's a mistake, because actually we do need to engage, because again, if you follow the Open Market Institute, for instance, on Twitter, they will display their political goal. So they say it. They say we do have a political goal, and we use antitrust as a Trojan horse for that. So it's not even a secret that, let's not care about empirical evidence. We do have a political strategy that we need to reach. And the last point I would like to make is that, and that refers to what I've described, which is we have no empirical study showing that it will be good or bad to break up big tech. But what they do, and they do that all the time, is that they discuss one micro practice. So they discuss one thing that eventually might be anti-competitive, and maybe that is anti-competitive, those practices. And based on those tiny practices, they argue for macro measures, such as breaking up big. I think this is totally disproportionate. If there is something micro illegal, then we should do something at the micro level to be sure to correct that. But once again, the overall strategy now is political, and I think that is why they argue for breaking up big tech, although we do have no idea if it's a good thing.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Thibault. That was great. Again, encourage everybody in the audience, really a fun paper to read. It's on the SSRN website. It's a free download. It's definitely worth the read. It's enjoyable and lots of good data points in there as well. So, Seth.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. So let me just start by saying I have clients in the technology space. However, all my comments today are my own. They're not on behalf of any client. So with that introduction, I think when we look at this issue, we have to think about the political and legal dimension, and as Thibault was talking about the political dimension. It's very important when we talk about antitrust to think about the political dimension. And I worked on Capitol Hill in the antitrust subcommittee in the Senate for almost 14 years, from 99 to early 2013. And there was an attitude then that antitrust is a highly specialized doctrine, and that politics really should play no role in it, and it really should be the province of practitioners, academics. I think that
very bipartisan.
And was bipartisan, and there was a bipartisan consensus on these issues. But I think as to the point of antitrust being a sort of a theoretical academic doctrine, that's really incorrect. And the reason for that is that the antitrust laws themselves are very vague. Section 1 of the Sherman Act forbids combinations and conspiracy and restraint of trade. What do you mean by restraint of trade? Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is most implicated by this, prohibits monopolization. What does that mean? And these are all in the eye of the beholder. And so the political dimension of antitrust becomes important, particularly now. And And antitrust enforcement, I contend, really does follow political winds. And so it's important to pay attention to what leading politicians are saying. And we see that right now. Antitrust is going through a moment like hasn't been seen in decades, maybe since the administration of Teddy Roosevelt more than 100 years ago. And in the first presidential debate, if any of you saw it, I think it was the second question was asked, which we do with the big tech companies. Should they be broken up? And that's, I can't remember. I've been watching presidential debates maybe since 1980, which dates me. But I can't ever remember a presidential debate dealing with an issue of antitrust policy, no less than the second question. So that shows you that there's a tremendous amount of political interest and ferment in this issue right now. And it comes across the political spectrum, so it's both right and left. And of course, on the left, we have people like Senator Warren and David Cicilline, Representative Cicilline, who's the chairman of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, and they definitely call for the breakup of big tech companies. But we have people on the right as well, and Ted Cruz of Texas, Senator Hawley of Missouri, Senator Blackburn of Tennessee, all are highly critical of big tech companies, and even no less of an antitrust authority than President Trump was quoted just a couple weeks ago in the Washington Post, saying the U.S. government should be suing Google and Facebook and all that. That's a quote. And then wagered that, quote, perhaps we will. So what's motivating this? Why are across the political spectrum there are these voices? Well, I think on the left side, there has been for a long time a suspicion of bigness. And we had a doctrine in antitrust that big is not bad. But folks on the left never sort of bought into that. And I think it's simply coming from that side. But on the right side of the political spectrum, which maybe for this moment is the more important one because the administration is in the hands of the Republicans and the antitrust authorities, there's a sense that the big tech companies, particularly Google, Twitter, Facebook, are somehow discriminating against conservative voices. They have anti-conservative bias. And that allocation, which is hotly denied by these companies, let me make clear, I think has given rise to a lot of hostility towards big tech and talk about breaking up the companies. And so we see next week a subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Constitution Subcommittee, chaired by Senator Cruz, is going to hold a hearing on Tuesday titled Google and Censorship Through Search Engines. And that's going to delve into that question. But the House Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee, obviously under the control of the Democrats, has announced several weeks ago a major investigation and a series of hearings on big tech and whether there should be, should it be broken up or should there be antitrust remedies. And next week, the same day as this hearing in the Senate I mentioned, is going to be a hearing on online platforms and market power, focused on innovation and entrepreneurship. Interesting thing about those two hearings are both next Tuesday afternoon. Google's testifying at both of those, and I can't remember a time when they've testified at two hearings at the same time. Obviously, different people. But so there's a tremendous amount of interest and ferment with respect to this topic at the political level. But having described that, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean from a legal standpoint? Now, clearly, you have enforcers like Megan Delrahim who have said that they're interested in exploring these issues, and so it's those are the people empowered under the antitrust laws to bring cases. But having said that, still the burden to bring an antitrust case and a monopolization case, as we have here, is very high, and the courts have been rather conservative. So in determining what makes up a legal monopolization, and the basic doctrine here is that monopoly is not illegal, and in fact is to be encouraged. That's why we want companies to strive to be monopolies to improve their product. But exclusionary conduct, not based on business acumen or better product conduct, is illegal. And the line between what is a legal monopoly and what's exclusionary conduct, illegally designed to maintain monopoly, is a very hazy line. It's difficult, but it's a high legal burden. And so anybody thinking about bringing a case against these companies is going to have to survive that legal burden, and it won't be easy. And and the topic of today's event is breaking up big tech. But I think it goes a lot beyond breaking up big tech. We should think about whether or not monopolization cases are going to be brought. And there can be a lot of remedies beyond a breakup. And as we saw with the Microsoft decision 20 years ago, Microsoft was put under a number of conduct remedies for a period of time. And that's much more typical than a breakup. So a breakup, the last major breakup, and I don't want to say the major breakup, I think the last breakup of a company under Section 2 of the Sherman Act for monopolization was in 1982, ordered in 1982 with the AT&T case. So that's over 37 years ago. It went into effect in 1984. It's a very unusual remedy. And I don't think, should there be antitrust cases brought against any of these companies, I don't think a breakup would be the most likely result. I think it'd rather be unlikely. And we saw in Microsoft, the district court originally ordered a breakup that went up to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and the D.C. Circuit said, yes, there's liability. Microsoft has attempted to illegally maintain its monopoly, but you, district court, haven't shown in any way why a breakup would would be a remedy that would take care of the competition issues. And I think, and just rejected the breakup and ordered the case remanded. Ultimately, the case was settled without a breakup. And I think that's a sort of a roadmap that we can think about, is how the Court of Appeals looked at a breakup remedy in that case. And so I think a breakup, even if there's antitrust action brought against these companies, is unlikely. So I guess, and I guess I'd also like to make another point. I know my time is limited, but
Yeah, you got a couple minutes.
okay. So Elizabeth Warren is one of the main proponents of this on the left side, on the Democratic side. And she wrote an article which was published in Medium in March saying it's time to break up Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Well, there are a couple interesting things about this. It's basically an article that talks about things that she claims are problematic, but mainly it's sort of a big is bad kind of piece. And these are big companies, they're dangerous, we should break them up. Well, to look at it that way is really not the way antitrust looks at these things. You have to you can't just lump these companies together. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Each of these companies and other companies like Facebook and Twitter and all these other companies, they have completely different business models. You have to look at the markets affected by these companies, what their business models are. You just can't say these are large tech companies and break them up. You can say that. A politician can say that. But a court is not going to adopt that approach. They're going to want to look at what is the alleged anti-competitive harm for each of these companies. So I think, that kind of argument is really not a successful one from an antitrust point of view. The other point I want to make, talking about Elizabeth Warren, is that she begins this piece by saying 25 years ago, Facebook, Google, and Amazon didn't exist. Well, that's interesting. That's the first sentence in that story. Is that making a case that these are durable monopolies that we need to break up today? I would think if 25 years ago these major companies didn't exist, shows us the ferment in this industry and the fact that there's not durable monopolies here. New companies emerge and fall away continuously. And I think that's another. I was surprised to read that as her opening statement in this article. That's another weakness. Now, having said everything that I said, it's important to it's important to follow the political winds. Another point is, if there are investigations, which we don't even know, it's bandied about in the press, but if investigations have started, monopolization, civil non-merger investigations, they usually take a year or more to complete. And who's going to be the decision maker at the time when these investigations are completed? It's not clear that it'll be Macon Delrahim. Will he still be there? Will it go beyond the Trump administration if the president loses re-election? If Elizabeth Warren's elected president, you can be sure she's going to put people in place that are going to follow these views. But so I think when we think about what's likely to happen, we've got to return to the political dimension as well. And there's really a lot of uncertainty. But I guess the message I want to leave is that the legal doctrine it's very difficult to bring these kinds of cases, and it's not at all an easy case to say these companies are going to be broken up.
Great. Thank you, Seth. Sure. So there actually was a logic to the order we went, and I started with Thibault to give a kind of economics perspective, and Seth to give somewhat a political, but really kind of an antitrust law perspective, which is really where your background has been so deep. And then Alex, I want to turn a little bit to maybe a little more of a technology perspective, because a lot, as Seth said, these are really different companies. A lot of times they're different industries. And a lot of these questions boil down to sort of how the technology works and what the technology is about in competition. So I'm going to turn over to you.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to touch on that. I think it's important to keep in mind how different these companies are. And I'll have to go into the tech part of that in the latter part of my comments. But I first want to follow up on Seth's point about how extreme a remedy would be to break up big tech companies. I think it's really important to keep in mind. And the most important point I want to make in my comments today is that we should keep our eye on the ball. And so when we have an antitrust problem, it's normally we think of that as prices are too high, output's too low, quality is too poor. The reason this debate can be confusing sometimes is because we don't witness those problems with big tech, right? Their products and services are either free or very low cost. Output is essentially unlimited for software services. So you hear in the debate a lot of other problems that are bandied about, but they're actually not antitrust problems. And so using antitrust's most extreme remedy to solve a non-antitrust problem doesn't make sense to me. And this is really following up on Thibaut's point as well about the public choice problem here. So can we achieve a stated goal with a particular intervention? And today we're talking about the particular intervention of breaking up big tech companies. And so I just want to run through a few of the most commonly cited problems and discuss why they're not actually antitrust issues, or not primarily antitrust issues. So privacy. Should we break up big tech to improve consumer privacy? That's misguided to me because we have privacy regulation in this country. We have sector-based privacy laws. And the FTC also regulates unfair and deceptive practices, which often are covered in privacy issues. So we have remedies that are outside the domain of antitrust for solving those privacy issues. Foreign interference in elections is a big issue in the news, with Russia interfering in the 2016 election. But there's good data from political scientists that this is often overstated. I saw one report that the number of ads purchased by the Russian government was less than what one political consultant would buy for an attorney's general race in Nevada. Okay, so these are, the number of people who saw these ads is very small, but it's a real issue, and I think we should address it. And so instead of breaking up big tech companies to stop Russia from buying ads on tech platforms, you could do things like pass the Honest Ads Act in the Senate or something similar, a very targeted remedy to that particular problem. You also hear, especially from Senator Hawley on the right, that social media is addictive and even harmful for mental health. He seems to suggest that you shouldn't even be using it, even though he himself does, which is ironic. I think, again, the science here is very debatable. I see evidence on both sides for the benefits and harms of using social media, but I think we should be very cautious about taking that away from people, as well as how does breaking up the large platforms into many small platforms make people use them any less. I don't see how that works. Hate speech and violent content, especially with the New Zealand mass shooting. There were big outcries that the big tech companies didn't take down those videos quickly enough as they were spreading throughout the internet. But my intuition, and I think there's a lot of good evidence for this, is that the economies of scale with content moderation mean that the big tech companies are even better placed than small platforms to take down this kind of content. It is in their interest to do so. I assure you that they're doing everything they can because it's not good business sense for them to leave violent content up. It goes against their explicit terms of service. So I think the issue would actually get worse if you broke up the big tech companies. Too much control over the public debate. So there is a lot of political speech and discussion that happens on these big tech platforms. But this is a particularly confusing problem to be raised for me because we live in the most abundant information society ever. So having too much control over the public debate is interesting today because just a few decades ago, there were 3 evening news channels where everyone got their evening news from. You had maybe your local newspaper that had a monopoly in the local market. So today, in today's age, the idea that you can't access a diversity of political speech or opinions, both online and in the analog world, is amusing to me. Censoring conservatives, I think Seth brought this up. That's, as far as we have the evidence for today, that's just a myth. Evidence shows that Fox News is actually the most dominant news publisher based on engagement on Facebook. So again, the conservatives often crying about being censored on news platforms are often doing so on online platforms. And then finally, in terms of particular issues we care about, the one that's most likely to be construed as an antitrust issue is these tech companies' dominance in their various local markets, but often breaking them up based on lines of business, and this gets to Rob's point about how these tech companies are very different, is if you break up Google along business lines, Google would still be dominant in search. There's not a really rational way to break up Google search, so that doesn't solve your problem in the search market if you think there's a problem. Amazon would still be dominant in e-commerce if you broke off Amazon Web Services or their logistics center. And I also don't really know how you'd break off the Amazon logistics from the online marketplace. Doesn't really make sense. So that's my biggest point today is that, again, if we want to use an antitrust's most extreme remedy, like breaking up companies, we should make sure that we have an antitrust problem that could potentially be solved by that. And to talk more about why these tech companies, why breaking up particular tech companies from a technology perspective wouldn't be easy, I'm glad to see we have Will Reinhardt here from the American Action Forum. I highly recommend reading a report he wrote recently on the back-end technologies that these platforms use. So oftentimes from the outside looking in, you think, oh, this is a conglomerate, so I can identify different apps. Like if you look at Facebook, for example, it'd be pretty easy to break off WhatsApp, Instagram, maybe Facebook Messenger from the main Facebook platform because they have different apps in the App Store. But these platforms actually share a ton of back-end technology. So in Facebook's case, for example, they use an internal technology called Bagpipe to load pages faster. They use an internal technology called Haystack to store photos efficiently, and Unicorn to search social data. And those are applicable across all their platforms. And you actually see this in your present experience of these platforms. If anyone was using Instagram, Facebook Messenger, or WhatsApp last week, but there was a problem loading images, and that problem occurred across all of their platforms because they're using the same technology. And so if you were going to break up Facebook, it's not a simple question of just spinning off the apps. You have to ask how they share the technology that they were using internally across teams. And how would they break up employees who are working across multiple projects? Would they be licensing issues? I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm just saying it's a much more complex issue than people who say breaking up big tech would be easy might lead you to think. And then in my Facebook example, this is true across all the big tech platforms. And I think there are definitely incremental remedies that could get us a lot of the at least knowledge about this sector that we aren't doing yet. So you see, I think bipartisan support for merger retrospectives. So instead of saying ahead of time that we need to just undo these mergers that were anti-competitive, let's study the issue first. We have Commissioner Slaughter who said we should do merger retrospectives to unwind these mergers. I would disagree with that, but Commissioner Wilson said at the FTC that we should at least study them to increase economic learning on a go-forward basis. And then my final point I want to make is that let's not forget that big tech is extremely popular. So this is in part a political debate. And so when people are asking to break up big tech, they're asking the government to do so. But in numerous surveys and polls, big tech, in terms of reputation, in terms of institutional trust, in terms of popularity, polls much higher than the government entities that would be tasked with breaking them up. And so I think it's interesting to see that, yes, in some quarters it's popular to talk about breaking up big tech, but in general, for the median American, for the average American, big tech remains extremely popular. And I'd just refer you to polls based at the Baker Center at Georgetown. Gallup has polling on this, and Axios and Harris as well.
Great, thank you, Alec. You had mentioned earlier in a talk I saw you at about the issue of bundling,
Yeah.
and usually I've had a great example of Flashlight. Can you maybe do a minute on that?
Yeah,
I think that's
definitely.
an
So I
important point.
think, in my opinion, a platform is just another word for a bundle of features. And so all features on the platforms that you use on a day-to-day basis are either made first-party, meaning by Facebook if we're on Facebook's platform, or Google or Apple, or third-party. These are the apps you download that aren't a part of the main platform that come in. So in the iPhone case, and this is where I love this with Elizabeth Warren, part of her big break up big tech proposal. She loves to use the baseball analogy of you can't be both the umpire, calling balls and strikes, and have a team in the game. That's on a principle unfair. And it makes some intuitive sense until you think more about how the MLB works. So in the MLB, the umpires are hired and fired by the team owners. The team owners in the offseason set the rules of the game. And they also own teams that participate in these games. And lastly, it's interesting because the MLB is exempt from antitrust law because it's been determined that it's pro-competitive. They need restraints of trade to run the league in an efficient pro-consumer way. And so I think you see the same kind of rationale and reasoning for why it makes sense on your Apple iPhone, that there are some apps that come bundled with the iPhone and some apps like things that you can download from third parties. And Rob's flashlight example is how an app that didn't ship with the first iPhone was a flashlight app. Very simple, easy to use, and you could download it from third parties for free. But over time, Apple said, you know what, like, it's super easy for us to bundle this into the platform. It's pro-consumer because they're going to give them the Apple version. You know, it has no ads. It doesn't, do sketchy things with your data. And then those app developers, there's good research on this. Once the things like flashlights get bundled into the main platform, they go off and build more innovative apps that are harder to be replicated by the main platform. So it's pro-innovation, pro-consumer, and bundling happens everywhere, and it's not necessarily anti-competitive.
Great. Thank you. I was struck by your example about Fox News and Facebook. My favorite example of that was I like to look at a lot of different sites. I was on Breitbart, and Breitbart had a whole thing decrying Facebook, and they were doing then a sort of like town hall decrying Facebook on Facebook.
Right.
So, okay, we should get rid of Facebook, but while we still have it, we're going to use it. So, all right, Jason.
All right, thanks, Rob, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you. Another in a long series of terrific events. ITI is the trade association of the technology industry, so I will begin by stipulating that some technology companies are big. Having made that stipulation, I will issue a second stipulation, which is that the government has a role in ensuring markets are competitive. From there, however, as my fellow panelists have noted extensively, we seem to have departed from a question of specific policy issues or specific markets, and we've grown that into a broad brush indictment of big technology companies. And the policy dialogue has therefore shifted from one of addressing those specific issues to one of rather dramatic remedies like antitrust. And in the same way that Seth suggested that we look to the political marketplace to see where some of these ideas are coming from, I also think it's important to revert back to that famous line from Brown Shoe, the antitrust case, that reminds us all that antitrust law exists to protect competition, not competitors. And thus it behooves us to look at who in the competitor marketplace is spending a lot of time suggesting that antitrust remedies for technology companies are worth imposing. And fortunately, there's no shortage of public messaging by some competitors who may feel challenged by the technology industry. So I think when we analyze what's happening and why it's happening, it's important that we look to some of the voices. And this has been true over the history of antitrust as well. So the retail community, for example, having expressed concerns about e-commerce, in particular e-commerce companies. I'll quote here from RILA, the Trade Association of Big Retail. Never heard that term used, but you're welcome to use that if you'd like. It's pretty clear to us that the FTC and different relevant regulators should be taking a much closer look at technology companies, and we are here to help. That's a nice sentiment there. The newspaper industry, which has expressed concern about the online ad marketplace. The Trade Association, the newspaper industry, testified before House Judiciary just last week and said that tech companies represent a new, potentially existential threat to the news industry. Cable television, which has long complained about broadband services delivering content. The head of the NCTA, a former antitrust lawyer himself, here's a quote from him. "For years, big tech companies have been extinguishing competitive threats by buying or crushing promising new technologies just as they are emerging. Competition policy must scrutinize more rigorously the deals that allow dominant platforms to kill competitive technologies in the cradle." And here's a last one. "For the life of me, I'm puzzled to know why the powerful corporations controlling these playing and talking machines are so totally blind to the moral and ethical questions involved." All right, that's a quote from 1906. That's from John Philip Sousa, who was a composer who you may know took a break from composing music to become a lobbyist. He lobbied Congress to outlaw the technology of the day that he considered a threat to his business, the player piano. He made his money selling sheet music. He thought the player piano was going to kill it, so he lobbied Congress to adopt legislation to outlaw the player piano. So this
He
happens.
did change his tune a little bit later.
That's a I can't can't believe it. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Thank you. But he did. Because once he saw that he sold music,
That's true.
he then changed.
He did. He did. That is true. That is true. I should have given him credit for that. No one from the Sousa estate hopefully is here to have raised that. Now, you probably know the statistics about how the technology industry has actually been beneficial to these same industries that are calling for antitrust review of these technology industry companies. The cable industry, for example, look at Comcast's last quarter numbers. They lost 121,000 video cable customers, but they gained a net of 375,000 broadband customers. Digital subscriptions are saving the news industry, as is digital advertising. Look at the New York Times last quarterly results. Print advertising fell 12% to $69 million. Online advertising rose 19% to $55 million. And of course, 24 years now after the commercial use restriction was lifted on the internet, still 90% of all retail in the US takes place at brick and mortar stores. So I would suggest that it's often important to kind of look behind the curtain when you hear these calls from competitive industries to analyze technology under antitrust. And this is true. This dates back to the beginning of antitrust. Senator John Sherman, for whom the Sherman Act is named, there's a great article that I can send anybody that's interested in it about his motivations in introducing the Sherman Act. He was actually upset at the former governor of Michigan, who was an antitrust purveyor himself, according to Sherman. He was associated with the Diamond Match Company. Sherman was mad at him and actually gave remarks on the Senate floor in the introduction of the Sherman Act saying we need to pass antitrust law to go after the Diamond Match Company. A former political rival happened to be associated with it. So this is nothing new, and it goes back. You can go back over time and look at antitrust law, and there's always somebody calling for it. That's not always a bad thing. I'll mention an example where I think that was actually a good thing in a minute. But if you look back at cases historically, it's always important to look at the competitors that are trying to make it happen. Rob mentioned the RCA case. There were a lot of TV manufacturers in the U.S. That were concerned about RCA, that lobbied the government to look into RCA. And as Rob goes into great detail in Big is Beautiful, which I originally thought was Rob's autobiography, but is actually a terrific treatise on the importance of looking at these issues with an eye toward why things are happening, not just what's happening. RCA did what it did in technology and has a great role in the history of television technology when they were required to license their technology for nothing. What did that lead to? Well, how many people have purchased a U.S. manufactured TV in the last 30 years? Well, there aren't any more. So that's where that ends up. The IBM suit is another good example. So at the same time that the government spent 13 years in its eventually aborted antitrust investigation of IBM, 24 of IBM's competitors filed private antitrust lawsuits against IBM. Now, every single one of those cases that went to court, IBM won. And as we all know, 13 years after opening the investigation, the antitrust division dropped it. There's a great quote in a 1982 article in the New York Times from William Baxter, who was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division. He said dropping the suit was the only sensible thing to do. It was based on what he called flimsy evidence, and he labeled the IBM case an example of antitrust enforcers, quote, trying to push the boundaries of antitrust protection beyond what the law provides. And again, there's great stories about those IBM competitors going to the Justice Department and saying, you got to investigate them. At the same time, they were filing their private suits. This happens in the modern day as well. The Philadelphia taxi industry went and filed an antitrust suit against Uber when they came into the market. Fortunately, the Third Circuit saw through that as an effort to block competition when it entered the market and tossed the suit. And they noted that although appellants may have been better off financially if Uber had not entered the Philadelphia taxi market, they have no right to exclude competitors from the market. I mentioned before that it's always important to look at who's behind things, and that's not always a bad thing. I will cite one antitrust suit that probably was a good thing, and that was AT&T. Now, AT&T had been under investigation from the Justice Department in some form since 1913, from the Kingsbury Commitments to the time in 1982, as Seth noted, that that the consent decree was entered into. That went into effect in 1984. There's a great book that I commend to all of you called The Deal of the Century by Steve Call, written back in 1986. It traces the history of MCI's engagement in this case. If MCI had not gone to justice and lobbied on Capitol Hill and tried to make this happen, that investigation never would have reached fruition. Again, not that AT&T's breakup was a bad thing. The consent decree was probably beneficial, but it really was MCI that played a very powerful role there, and I think that's important to remember. So, today, unlike AT&T, which owed its success to a government grant of monopoly, no technology industry company player, regardless of size today, owes its success to a government grant of monopoly. So we're a very different, innovation-driven marketplace today. So as you ask questions here inside the Beltway, because this is an inside the Beltway issue. We know the surveys, we know the research, we've done it ourselves at ITI that show that consumers love technology products, they love innovation, they're not complaining about the products and services they carry around, nor are they complaining about their ability to get whatever they want delivered to their doorstep in 2 hours. But using antitrust law to target the nation's technology leaders is not only overbroad, as we've heard, there are plenty of policy pathways to dealing with specific issues like privacy that we need to address. But we want to make sure we don't listen to the wrong voices, that we don't listen to competitors that are looking to use antitrust law to hobble their competitors because they're concerned about adapting their business plans accordingly. And as was mentioned, these are our crown jewel companies here in the U.S. Anybody that's had a chance to look at Mary Meeker's latest slide presentation, which is a great annual read, knows that her latest stats from 2 weeks ago, China now has 21% of the world's internet users. India has 12% of the world's internet users. The U.S. is in third place now with that. China now has 8 of the top 30 technology companies in the world. Look, companies are going to continue to innovate. We're going to continue to have innovative products and services launched in the marketplace, but let's make sure that we address specific policy issues with the right policy tools. If you're concerned about privacy, let's adopt federal privacy legislation. If you're concerned about retailers having their own house brands, let's look at whether Kirkland should be allowed to sell gin at Costco, which is terrific, by the way. I commend it to you. It makes a great martini. Or Target should have Cat and Jack clothes, which I dressed my kids in for years. Or, hey, look, I wear, I'm not wearing them today, but Bonobos pants, which are great. I love their clothing. They're owned by Walmart. Should Walmart have its own house brands? I don't know, but if that's a concern, let's look at that specific issue. But let's not allow incumbent industries to send us all down the wrong path and use antitrust law to hobble successful market entrants and competitors, or to say that big is bad just because big companies happen to have truly innovative, beneficial products that people like to buy.
Right. Okay.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. So I know this has been sort of one-sided, shall we say. We certainly have attempted in the past to do debates on this. I debated Tim Wu. If you haven't read Tim's book, I encourage you to read that. Columbia professor on antitrust. And I would certainly be happy any time, any day, any place to debate Barry Lynn at Open Markets. In general, I think having these debates would be quite useful. I'll reach out to Barry again and see if he wants to do it. But having said that, I do think one of the interesting things here, when Mike Lind and I wrote our book, we read a lot of the literature about the what we call the neo-Brandeisian movement, which is kind of resurrecting Justice Brandeis's views that big is just inherently bad. As Brandeis said, it's the mark of Cain. Any firm that gets large has the mark of Cain. In other words, the only way to get large is through sinning. And it was very interesting. One person on this side who's involved in the movement said it's basically a kind of an internal article to the group. we're going to be really, really hard pressed to win this argument on the basis of consumer welfare because these companies are so unalloyed good for consumers that we have to come up with some other argument. And so I want to actually ask Seth here because one of the bedrocks of antitrust doctrine theory for the last at least 50 years has been the consumer welfare doctrine standard. Joe Kennedy wrote a piece. Can you talk a little bit about that? What does that mean?
Sure.
Why is that important?
And it's become somewhat controversial in recent years in this debate. So the idea is that what antitrust should be about is serving consumers and enhancing consumer welfare, and it shouldn't be about, as Jason said, protecting any one competitor. And that was sort of a bedrock of antitrust law for the last 30 or 40 years. It was sort of an outgrowth of the University of Chicago thinking. But because of it comes from the Chicago School, and because it doesn't take into account other issues, it's come under a lot of criticism, particularly from the left. Now, the interesting thing about the consumer welfare standard is that the criticism is that all the consumer welfare standard cares about is the price that consumers pay. And if consumers are paying a low price, then a practice can't be anti-competitive or against the antitrust laws, while it might lead to income inequality or some other thing that is bad. But in fact, as Macon Delrahim recently said in a speech in Israel a few weeks ago, consumer welfare standard can account to a lot more than just price. It can take into account quality and the effects on innovation. It's really a flexible doctrine. It's not just focused on price, but it's looking at to see whether practices or mergers, but we're talking about practices here, have an effect of limiting consumer welfare or enhancing consumer welfare. In my mind, that is a proper standard as applied, and it does mean more than just price. It could incorporate privacy if a practice or a merger leads to a decline in privacy protections. Well, that would be against the consumer welfare standard, as I understand it, as Macon Delrahim talked about it. But I think if we think that antitrust should go into more issues than just consumer welfare, and I sort of broadly think of consumer welfare, but income inequality, the effect on labor markets, the effect on political speech, all these sort of hazy concepts, well, that's a dangerous road to go down, because I talked about the discretionary nature of antitrust enforcement. It just makes it even more discretionary, and it leads to an end of a consensus about what antitrust is about. So what you're going to see, if that's the approach we go, different administrations are going to take different approaches to antitrust, including in the big tech sector, and it's going to go back and forth between Republicans and Democratic. If it's Elizabeth Warren is the president, she's going to take a very different view than even a Joe Biden would take, or a mainstream Republican would take. So I think we got to be very careful about thinking about abandoning the consumer welfare standard.
Great. Any other thoughts on that, Farmer?
Yeah. May I jump in on that?
Yeah, Thibault, go ahead.
I think I've heard the word fairness, so maybe it's just my brain with playing tricks on me. But if indeed the word was mentioned, I would like to, because as you know, fairness is being mentioned more and more in Europe. And I think the neo-Brandesians are actually saying that's something that is good, that we do it in Europe. I mean, that we do mention fairness as being something more than consumer welfare, and are pushing for that in the US. So here, what I would like to say very briefly is that, so Margaret Vestager mentioned the word fairness in 31 of her speeches. None of them date from 14, only one from 2015, 5 from 16, 5 from 17, 9 from 19, and already 5 from this year. So more and more she's using the concept. So I think there are two ways to look at that. Either markets became unfair 3 years ago, and they were not prior to 2016, or fairness is a political concept. And I think what is really, in a sense, scary is that if you read her speeches, she actually opposes fairness and prosperity. She says that prosperity is important, but maybe sometime we should get less prosperity and more fairness. And I think this is where you see that the consumer welfare standard is being totally taken out of the picture. Indeed, if we don't reach any type of welfare, but we just want to reach something else, First, it's not the world I want to live in, but I think it's definitely the direction where European competition is going. And some people in the US are taking that as an example. So I think, and I'm actually not sure whether or not we should actually, make a distinction between the two. Prosperity and fairness, they go actually together in my mind, but not in the mind of a top EU official.
Yeah, the stat I really like from our book is that there are more dentists in America in the top 1% than there are people who are software engineers. So if we're going after unfairness, going after my dentist. Well, I love my dentist, but
one small point to follow up on Seth's about discretionary enforcement. I think there's a danger of moving towards more discretion. Seth earlier mentioned Trump making public comments about particular companies being investigated or sued. I think in Elizabeth Warren's proposal and the Medium blog post, I think a problem with that is under discussed is that she specifically called for unwinding mergers between Amazon and Whole Foods, Amazon and Zappos, Facebook and WhatsApp, Facebook and Instagram, Google and Waze, Google and Nest, and Google and DoubleClick. And I think if we're concerned about rule of law issues in a current administration where people are calling for specific actions prior to analysis and investigation by practitioners, by experts, I think we should be concerned on both sides of the aisle.
And remember, Rob, at the press conference or the remarks where Senator Warren rolled out this plan, she mentioned the companies that Seth mentioned, and then she got a question from a reporter that said, "What about Apple?" And her response was, "Yeah, break them up too." Right. Kind of like, oh yeah, they're also a big technology company, so we should also break them up. And it just shows you, and I think it's been pretty clear over the course of everybody's presentation that this is politics. This is this is driven by some outside interests, not by an actual market analysis that you would expect to see in an antitrust case.
So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. If you have one, just feel free to raise your hand, and then wait. Here we go over here, Rachel, and then please just say who you are, and here we go. Thanks.
Of course. Hi, Chase Blazik from the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. First of all, I really appreciate it. I have a background in tech, so I agree with 95% of the points you're making, which is fantastic, especially the addressing specific problems with specific policy issues, not just breaking up big tech. But I did want to ask, because it does seem like some of the big tech companies, especially Facebook, are having more of a say on free speech, even if it's not affecting free speech. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, they are saying, we do want to regulate speech a little bit more so that it's more of a friendly environment on Facebook. It doesn't seem like there's any sort of critical mass happening there where people should be worried about free speech. But even recently, he said Facebook should push more for a living room environment with a small community of people speaking to each other, rather than you just speaking to your closest 500 friends, in quotes. And the only other social media app I know that does that is WeChat, and they do it so they can control dissent. Obviously, I don't think Facebook is trying to control dissent, but there are calls by big tech companies and big tech leaders like Mark Zuckerberg to, if not regulate free speech, to have a say in it. One, do you think there's anything that needs to be done about this? Will it settle itself? If Facebook does a private living room model, will they just implode and it'll fix itself? Does anything need to be done, or do you think this will blow over?
I can go ahead and take that. I think I'm always skeptical when large companies, and we talk a lot about how we like Facebook, Google, Amazon, all these companies, but I'm skeptical even when they ask for more regulation or more mandates because they have a huge team of compliance attorneys and engineers to implement any new compliance policies, and so that's going to be a heightened barrier to entry for new startups that want to create their own social networks. And I think as of now, in the current regulatory environment that we've had since the 90s, that is relatively hands-off and light touch with the tech sector. In today's day and age, you can start your own social media platforms if you want to implement alternative terms of use and terms of service. I know Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychology professor, is currently trying to launch a new platform online for right-wing people that can say whatever they want that would currently violate Facebook standards. Best of luck to him. If it works, then that means that there's demand for his product and people want that kind of speech environment. But I don't think that there are currently barriers, and adding new barriers, I think, might even make the problem worse.
Also, just to add to that, one of the complaints, Alec, that you raised that people are asserting is the hate speech in the New Zealand case. So a lot of these companies are between a rock and a hard place. They're criticized for not controlling speech, and then they're criticized for trying to find ways to modulate it. it's a really tough place to be in, and in that sense, I think it's a societal question. Society has to be the ones that gives guidance here, and that's going to happen eventually, but it'll be a rocky road, I would argue. So I think there's a right here, yeah, and then we'll go here.
Good morning, it's Preston Knowles, and I'm working with a Marcom agency, Outcast agency, and we're rooted out of Silicon Valley in San Francisco. We represent 3 of the 5 of those big tech companies, so naturally I have an interest in this. But we also have other retailers and e-commerce companies and brands that we're working with. Do any of you all have an opinion on what the economic effect is going to be on these small businesses and these businesses who are trying to advertise in these companies if we were to break these companies up, and what effect does that trickle down to the consumer who's going to have to pay more?
I think the short answer is that the technology industry has created enormous opportunities for legacy businesses to take advantage of new revenue opportunities. This is not the what the buggy whip industry did when the car was invented. It was hard to see how to pivot. You got to go make saddles instead, and then when that didn't work, you make something else. I would go back to the stats I cited about the New York Times. Their digital ad revenue is growing at 20%. Their print ad revenue is dropping at 12% a quarter. It doesn't mean that they're not going to still have an ad-driven model. It's just they need help in figuring out how to derive those digital ads. And a lot of the companies that we've been talking about today do that business, are in that business, and are creating that revenue opportunity for them. So for companies that are legacy, whether they're retailers or otherwise, technology creates new opportunities, it creates new markets, but you got to be willing to change your business plan. You have to do that, have that Clayton Christensen moment where you decide, it's okay to pivot and take advantage of new opportunities. That's what they should be doing.
We can go right over here. I think, by the way, just to respond, I think the bigger issue there really is privacy. We filed something with the European Commission a couple of weeks ago and had some data that showed that the GDPR really did hurt small advertisers. It led to more concentration. And so we have to be careful also in some of these other spaces that we don't have inadvertent anti-competitive outcomes.
My name is Anupam Khanna. I've been spending the last 10 years in the tech industry, but in the last few between India and here. And actually looking at tech policy both in Europe and in America with a view towards advising governments in developing countries. Having said that, and I've been accused, especially in India, of being being a tech booster on the one side and too favorably inclined towards the big companies. So I would like to go back to, I think I'm glad that Rob acknowledged that over the last couple of years, even within the US, I found this panel very loaded to one side. And the part that I'm missing, and I think was missing, is the economic perspective. And there are many different, I have long notes on it, and maybe I'll communicate with them. One is this last point. I think the current wisdom in economics is, and I can say the hardcore sort of even neoliberal, that we miss political economy and economics at our own peril, the relationship. And specifically this particular issue, which is that issues of fairness and inequality are not soft issues. They are very critical. Going back to the work of 30, 40 years from Atkinson, inequality aversion has a lot of, it's an economic concern. And so I don't think you can just deny it. I don't believe Thibault's presentation had really anything to do with economics. It was the sociology of political behavior. So let me just mention 2 or 3 things. There's the question of consumer welfare. I personally believe it's a very good one. It served well, but there are dimensions which are missing, and especially when you put it in practice, especially when you put it in the context of an economic, a judicial system which is much more competitive. You don't have suo motu type of policies and interventions here. You argue between them, and there, when you have inequality in resources, fairness becomes an issue. The reason fairness has become an issue recently is because economists have realized that they have, Pareto optimality is not acceptable to society. All institutions are created by humans.
Okay, so, why don't we? Good, thank you.
So I think we are missing that whole dimension
Sure.
in the debate.
So if I can just try to take a crack at that. I think you're absolutely right to talk about income inequality, and it's a major issue for this country and for other countries. The question is it an antitrust issue? And that's, the focus of this discussion today. And if we're concerned about income inequality, we should take steps to resolve it. But you can't, antitrust may not be well equipped to deal with that. Now, hopefully a result of a proper antitrust enforcement will be to reduce income inequality, but that's a byproduct. It's not, antitrust doesn't capture all of economic policy, and I think we have to keep that in mind. As I said, it's already such a vague doctrine, and just to add these major concepts as part of antitrust, I don't think is really realistic.
I just add also, we reviewed that, the scholarly literature on that. I agree with Seth, by the way. I think income inequality is a big problem. We reviewed that literature in our book, and there's a number of very good studies from academics that actually show that as firm size increases, inequality goes down. Countries with bigger firms have less inequality than countries with smaller firms. So it's both longitudinally and across countries. Secondly, the factoid that I love the best on this is a very good study that showed that the top 15 hedge funds or managers or financial types earn more than the top 500 CEOs combined. And those CEOs include people like Tim Cook. So, the idea that somehow inequality is growing, which is true, and it's a problem, that's true, but somehow why focus only on this one sector? Why focus on big? The evidence really, I don't think, is very compelling, but. Actually, just all right, since you raised that, it's important to raise that. Go to the facts. So I published something on that recently, a report looking at taxing robots, and we looked at that data. When you look at that, that's just simply not true. When you review at least in the U.S., when you review the Bureau of Economic Analysis on income shares, what you find is that the labor share of income has gone down. Now, why is that? Everybody then on the left or they brandeis and say, well, labor share of income has gone down because capital share has gone up. It's actually not true. What went up are two things. Rentier income went up. So landowners, building owner income went up. That's not tech companies. And secondly, proprietor income went up. More people are self-employed, or there's more self-employment income. So the notion that labor income went down because capital income went up is really just not true. Other questions? Right here, and then here, and then. All right, so why don't we do two questions at a time? We'll try to get through everybody and keep our responses a little shorter.
Okay, cool. Tom Struble from Archer Institute. Question about the politicization of antitrust. So antitrust law is going to be enforced by private plaintiffs, state AGs, but at the federal level, we have the FTC and DOJ, who both have, there's not coterminous jurisdiction because of criminal antitrust enforcement can only be done by DOJ, but broadly, we have two antitrust enforcers at the federal level, and they don't always have the same ideas about certain antitrust issues, and at least one of them is an executive branch agency that technically could be directed by the president. There's been a long, practice of the president not interfering in the DOJ's antitrust work, but there's suspicion about the AT&T Time Warner merger, and we talk about future presidential candidates directing antitrust enforcement. Some people have proposed moving all federal antitrust enforcement to the FTC, an independent agency, to remove that possible political interference, or at least reduce it. I'd be curious to hear the panel's thoughts on that proposal.
Okay. And then why don't we just do the second question, I think right here.
Hi there, my name is Avery James. I'm an intern at Niskanen Center and a rising senior at American University. My quick question is just, there we go. I want to know specifically, Seth Bloom, you gave some great examples about a lot of problems that aren't antitrust problems. And I just was wondering if you could elaborate on what anti-competitive things are of concern. A recent story I just want to bring to mind is there's some worries about, for example, Google using a third-party vendor with a lyrics genius, I believe, that put special watermarks of sorts on their lyrics and found they had made their way into Google's automatic result. I'm curious, how you would analyze that as bad for consumers or good. Thanks.
So why don't you also take the first one?
I will. Let me address the first one first. And I completely agree with the notion that it's a crazy system we have, that we have two agencies enforcing the same law. One of them part of the executive branch, one of them is an independent agency. I would favor having the FTC be the sole antitrust agency. And actually, in the year 2000, when I first started working in the Senate, I wrote into a oversight hearing speech of Senator Cole, my boss, saying, why are there two antitrust agencies? So I'm glad to see now that people are talking about this. But I think this is a historical accident. The Sherman Act and Clayton Act were passed. The DOJ had the authority to do this. The FTC Act, to enforce that law, the FTC Act was passed in 1914, actually the same time as the Clayton Act. And the FTC also had the authority to enforce the antitrust laws. And they didn't really think at the time that the inconsistency, it leads to bureaucratic fights, it leads to inconsistent results. It's a crazy system. However, to change it would take an act of Congress, which I don't think is very likely, unfortunately, although Senator Lee has talked about this recently, because the institutional prerogatives of members of Congress, the Judiciary Committee with oversight over the Justice Department, the Commerce Committee with oversight over the FTC, neither would want to see their powers removed. So that's how I would respond to that. I don't think that I have a good answer for you, but that's just the system that we're left with. As to your point, by the way, so I hate to be a dissenting voice because we've all been totally in agreement, but I don't mean to say that I don't think there's a role for antitrust investigations of some of these companies. Sure. And one of them, I think, that is really warrants antitrust scrutiny and perhaps antitrust action. I'm not sure about a breakup, but antitrust action is Google. And I've been personally very vocal in that. In fact, when I was on the antitrust subcommittee, we had the first hearing in 2011 on this issue, and Eric Schmidt testified. It led to the FTC investigation. I think there's a lot of cause for concern about Google, and I think the EC sanctions I generally agree with, and particularly, and I think Google of all these companies is the one company that has to worry. And particularly, you mentioned that issue is an issue that I think is worthy of investigation, but the issue of the Android operating system, and that Google telling phone manufacturers you have to put Google apps and not install competitors' apps. Well, in 1998, the Justice Department brought a very similar case. It was against Microsoft, and it was because Microsoft was telling OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, computer manufacturers, that they had to pre-install software that was Microsoft software and not, such as Internet Explorer, and not install competitor software, such as Netscape Navigator, which essentially destroyed Netscape Navigator, but they contended that was an effort for Microsoft to maintain its monopoly. As I said earlier, that didn't result in a breakup, but it resulted in a Court of Appeals decision of the D.C. Circuit saying, yes, that was anti-competitive conduct. And I think for that reason, we have that D.C. Circuit precedent. That puts Google in has a lot of concerns here. And the DOJ didn't take that investigation to do nothing.
I want to turn over to Alec, but thank you. By the way, for your interest in that, there's a great podcast called Business Wars, and it's just these competitions between business. And one of them is on Netscape versus Microsoft, a really deep dive. It's like a 5-part series, a lot of fun. Alec?
Just quickly on, I'm glad you brought up the Google Genius case. I think a lot of the facts are still in dispute, but from what we know today, I think this is a great example of how some people might call it an antitrust issue, but it's really a copyright intellectual property issue. And from what we do know right now is that Google also licenses the underlying lyrics itself, and it works with a service called Lyric Find to get those lyrics. And so maybe there was some way that Genius content got caught up in Google's algorithm, and maybe there's a problem to be fixed there. But under current law, they have not violated copyright law because they license the underlying lyrics themselves. And insofar as there's a problem there, it can be handled in a copyright domain, not an antitrust domain.
And I think Google also came out and said that they were addressing that specific problem with an algorithm fix.
Okay.
May I add something on the first point, on the first question? Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very briefly. Looking from your system from the outside, it does look weird to have two agencies, and it takes a lot of time to understand why. What I've done is that I also had a look at the actual budget of those two agencies, and what you see is that it's strictly correlated to the amount of fines they impose. And actually, when they send the budget request to the Congress, it's the first and almost the only thing they mention. It's that, last year we've done so well, give us more money, basically. And I think what would be interesting is to think, instead of maybe, indeed taking another act to combine those two agencies, to find probably a new way to assess whether or not they do their job as they should, instead of just focusing on the amount of sanctions. And there are different ways to do that, but I guess it's a different topic. So, but that's an interesting issue, I think.
Okay. There's a question here.
Hi, Max Fillion. I work with MLEX. This question is directed at Thibault, and although Alec, I believe you'll probably have some input on this, but You said that there's we don't really have any way of understanding whether breaking up big tech would be good or better for consumers than the current state of play. But we do have some sort of precedent in breaking up the big tech sector, like the big tech sector of the time. I believe it was Jason that mentioned the AT&T case. And so I'm wondering what the difference is now between these brand new social media companies and the big tech of yesteryear.
Yes, do have 2 hours to answer. No, I think. Well, first, I think two different things. The first is that it's interesting to get to know why the companies in a dominant position. Let's say they are. I'm not even discussing whether or not they are. Let's say big tech are in a dominant position. Do they get a dominant position from what they've done on the market, or because at some point they were helped by the government? I would say it's one difference. And the other one is the network effect. And actually a good paper was published, an article in the Wall Street Journal explaining if you were to break up tech companies because of network effects, you will have 10 different pieces, and one of them will become as big as the previous one. So not only it's something that is not desirable, but also it is ineffective probably. So I would say it's probably the main difference. But once again, 2 hours will be probably needed.
Yeah, and just one small point there that I think that really shows the analogy is that AT&T was broken up into, as part of the breakup, in addition to many other remedies, where they're broken up into 7 regional monopolies, and then over time, because it makes sense to have a national telephone network, they merge back together. And we still have multiple phone networks today, but I think you see the same thing if you had, a Northwest Facebook, a Southwest Facebook, like they would merge together. One of them would dominate the others.
I think also to that question, though, it's an important point which I was going to ask the panel. We haven't talked about it, and that's market definition. So the market of AT&T was really calls to the customer. I would argue the market for Google and Facebook is the ad market. That's the relevant market to look at with regard to concentration. And do these companies have market power that's distortive in that? And you could argue they don't. They're only, I think, accounted for 25% of total ads, which is a lot, but it's not a thing. Any comments just sort of on how we should think about market definition going forward?
Well, market definition is absolutely a crucial issue, and you can't think of antitrust analysis without market definition. I might disagree with you on the just with respect to Google. Yes, the ad market is part of it, but if you're a company trying to market your wares, where you are on the Google search engine ranking is crucial. If you're on page 12, no one's going to see you.
But that's a conduct issue, Seth, though.
Right, but
as opposed to a structure issue.
But I think what I'm saying is it's more than just the ad market. And I'm not sure what the market is there. I have to think more about that. But that sort of goes beyond the ad market. I think the ad market's very important. So that's, I guess, my only point of difference with you.
Well, I would almost phrase it as like, what's the job to be done here? If I'm a business, the job to be done by advertising, marketing, or organic reach is the job to be done is to reach my customers with a message. And so I think that almost asks for a broader market definition if you're trying to include things like non-paid search. And as we know, broader market definitions lead to results showing less market power, less ability to raise prices and lower output.
Okay.
If I may on that, because we've discussed the Google cases, it was quite surprising, to say the least, to see the European Commission decision in the Android case, the second one, saying that actually Android is not competing with with Apple iOS, because Apple iOS, the iPhone is more expensive than what Android phones usually are. Therefore, it's not the same market. I mean, in the end, if you were to develop something, you probably are to develop that application for both, right? Because you do want to reach the maximum consumers. So it's not super convincing, and I'm actually super interested in seeing in the future, now that we know that iOS and Android is not in the same market, if they were to have like a merger case at some point, how the European Commission will actually deal with the issue. Not that they have said that.
And we also, Will, I want to let you have the last question, but we shouldn't forget sort of Schumpeterian dynamics. I think several of the speakers, including Seth, you raised it. We shouldn't forget that Symbian was the largest operating system. Probably nobody even knows what Symbian is, but it was the Nokia operating system, and there was actually right before Nokia jumped off the pool head first with no water. There was a lot of concern about monopoly with them, and we should bring a monopoly case. And probably not a good idea. So, Will.
So, Will Reinhardt, American Action Forum. Everyone here has kind of talked about this Warren Medium post, and the one thing that actually I find that very few people have talked about is their second effective policy remedy that exists within it, which is effectively like a neutrality mandate, and that kind of reminds me, at least, conjures up in my mind the fact that a lot of the conversation has also tended towards some sort of neutrality mandate or interoperability mandate, and more specifically an interoperability mandate for some of these larger platforms. I think personally that's just a much more likely scenario, but I'm just wondering if you think that that's something that actually probably could pass like a congressional muster. Because, when we talk about telecom, we're talking about unbundling, and obviously there's a whole bunch of varieties of this, but basically mandating that a certain kind of neutrality or service occurs between these competitors seems to be much more of a likely outcome and a likely policy. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting part of her proposal, and I'm glad you drew the telecom analogy, because what you're talking about is common carriage, and that was the bargain that AT&T struck with the government, right? Yeah, we could exactly. Well, the government will give you a grant of monopoly. We'll give you access to poles and ducts and conduits. You can string your wires. We'll insulate you from competition from any other facility. We'll guarantee you 100% market share, but in exchange for that, you have to agree to serve everyone at regulated prices. And AT&T said, sounds good, and that lasted for 125 years. Frankly, I don't think that's a particularly good model, and the reason that model is not applicable to the technology companies that we're talking about today is because they actually arrived at their positions by innovating, not by the government putting a thumb on the scale to their benefit. So the idea that the government would regulate whether it's content or interoperability or portability of data or whatever it is that the government seeks to do, I think the question you have to ask is, why would anyone want to strike that bargain? Why would they want the government to step in and regulate? In the case of AT&T, it was because in the absence of that, the government made a policy decision that rural America would never have access to telecom service in the absence of common carriage, because AT&T wouldn't have an incentive to invest in rural areas unless they were guaranteed 100% market share, and that worked out well for as long as it did. I think in the technology industry, those incentives are not necessary. The tech industry isn't asking for government to insulate them against competition, quite the opposite, in fact, and therefore that kind of bargain I don't think makes sense here.
Great. Unless there's a burning desire to make a last comment. Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank a great panel here. Really, really insightful. And Thibault, thank you for joining us from afar and your insights into European antitrust policy in particular. And thank you all for coming. So please join me in thanking a great panel. Thank you.